Oh, there we go. So welcome to this interview with Katherine Stewart. I'm Jimmy Reeder, a blogger, a speaker, founder of Imagine, a learning community working for a better world. Katherine Stewart is an investigative reporter and an author, has covered religious liberty, politics, policy, education for over a decade. Her latest book is called The Power Worshippers. I discovered it last year and have read it 3 times already. I encourage everyone to do so, and I hope you'll learn something from this interview today. It documents in detail the religious right's rise to political power. For too long, the religious right masqueraded, in Katherine's word, as a social movement preoccupied with a number of cultural issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage. But Katherine Stewart reveals a truth that America's religious right has evolved into another movement that we call Christian nationalism now, seeking to gain political power and impose its vision on all of society. I know its vision is different than mine and different than Katherine's, I presume, since I've read her book. Welcome, Katherine. That's just a little bit. There's so much to tell about you. What else would you like to say?
Well, thank you so much. First, I want to say thank you so much for having me. And thanks for anybody listening in, for joining this conversation. It's really great to be here. You know, my journey in this area really started in 2009 when I learned that a Good News Club was coming to our daughter's public elementary schools. Now, Good News Clubs, as you probably know, are after-school clubs designed to convert children in their earliest years of learning, often kids who are too young to read, into a deeply reactionary form of evangelical Christianity. And, you know, before that event, I really wasn't thinking too much about these issues. And I really took so many things about our democracy for granted. But as I saw how the clubs operated in public schools and how they were confusing little kids into believing that the religion of the club was endorsed by the school, I started to become really concerned. You know, public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds, especially of little children. They can't make a distinction between something that's taught to them in school and something that's endorsed by the school. They think if it's in the school, the religion, it must be the religion of the school. And to be clear, I don't have a problem with kids talking about religion with their friends at school, but I do have a problem with kids being deceived into thinking that their school endorses a particular religious viewpoint. And I saw this happening in our community. And I also saw how kids attending the clubs were being directed by the adults leading the clubs to engage in what I could only describe as faith-based bullying and bigotry against kids of other faiths, kids whose parents were Christian but attending the wrong kinds of churches. And so this was really where my journey began. I thought the more I learned, the more I recognized that these Good News Clubs were part of a larger attack on public education. And the attack on public education was really just one part of a broader attack on America as a modern constitutional democracy.
Oh, that's great. And then you went on to write The Power Worshippers after you wrote about that movement, that Good News Club. Tell us a little bit more about how you define Christian nationalism, the movement as a whole.
Sure. Well, Christian nationalism is not Christianity, and it's not a religion. It is a political phenomenon that involves the manipulation and exploitation of religion for political purposes. So I think of it as combining two different kinds of things. On the one hand, it's a set of ideas, an ideology. And on the other hand, it's a political movement, a quest for power, an organized quest for power. So as an ideology, Christian nationalism boils down to the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, Christian here referring to I would say, a conservative or fundamentalist conception of Christianity. And it says that all of our problems stem from the fact that we've forsaken the supposed heritage of that founding. So it's really about, it's like a kind of identity politics. Who gets to properly belong as an American and who does not? But this ideology is really just a tool for a political machine that turns this story, this sort of mythology, into political power. So I want to talk about how that machine works, that political machines. And I really lay it out in my book, The Power Worshippers. The machine is both leadership driven and also organization driven. And the infrastructure of the movement is made up of a number of different organizations that can be grouped into categories. There are right-wing policy groups. There's a vast legal advocacy sphere. There are fundraising arms that take in large amounts of money from small donors and donor groups that take in large amounts of money from uber wealthy donors. There are elite networking groups like the Council for National Policy that gets much of the leadership on the same page. There are legislative initiatives, very sophisticated data initiatives, and of course, a vast media and messaging apparatus. And then, of course, there's a sort of pastoral arm of the movement. There are networks involving tens of thousands of churches that contribute to the effort. So, in essence, it's a means of persuading a large subsection of the American public to vote for the political candidates that the movement favors, empower movement leaders, and enshrine the policies that they want in our lives and society. It's a way also, especially in the legal sphere, a lot of the policies that movement leaders want are not particularly popular among most Americans, but they know if you get the courts, you can get the country.
Right.
So sometimes I feel like it's easier to recognize these things when they're happening in other countries. So when a leader like Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran bind themselves tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. And they do it to guard against any democratic check on their power or investigation of their corruption or their nepotism or their cronyism, and also to sort of shield themselves against abuses that they may be perpetrating against their own people. And so we can see a lot of similarities among, religious nationalists around the globe. And there are, of course, nuances specific to different countries, but we see a lot of the similarities in some of the methods. And even there is, in some instances, collaboration between America's religious nationalists with religious nationalists in other places.
One thing I really appreciate about your book is what you've just been drawing out, that we need to be careful that we don't just look at individual people who get caught up in the movement, but we need to understand all the leaders and all the money behind it and all the organizations that are a part of making it happen. And I would encourage all of our readers, if they haven't read your book yet, to really do that, because there's so much detail that makes all of that so clear. And then the global part of the movement that you've described, it's not just a U.S. Christian movement, but it's a global movement as well. So I really appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So once people learn about this, what they always ask me is, so what can I do? What can I do about this? How do you answer that question?
Wow. I often think of the words of David Barton, who I wrote about in my book. He's one of the movement's key leaders and myth makers. And he wrote a book early on. He wrote, "Commit yourself to this engagement for the long haul, for the duration. Arm yourself with the mentality of a marathon runner, not a sprinter." We have to remember that the movement is as strong as it is because its leaders have committed themselves to this movement in the long haul. They've been investing in the infrastructure of the movement for decades. And they started, I would say, the contemporary Christian nationalist movement that we see today. It has very deep roots in our history, but it got a lot of loft, right? A lot of force. I would say in the late 1970s, early 1980s, with a group that called itself the New Right, that felt the Republican Party had become too liberal, too soft on communism, and they wanted to drag they're upset about the civil rights movement. They wanted to drag the Republican Party to the right, and they created some of the organizations like the Council for National Policy, Heritage, many of these other organizations that are still active today. Some organizations like the Christian Coalition sort of faded out and other new ones came in. But what they did is they dedicated themselves to creating an organizational infrastructure They were very much sort of on the outs at that time. History wasn't going in their favor, but through all that, dedication and work, that's how they got to where they are today. They also recognized that, if you can get the courts, you can get policies that you want. In fact, you can get, so much of the kinds of governance you want in our country. So question is, what can be done? I mean, I'm going to quote another religious right leader, Ralph Reed. He said, pay no attention to the polls. All that matters is who turns out on election day. He's right. We need to be proactively involved in voter turnout. We need to be involved in the preservation of voting rights. And to that end, there are things we can do as individuals, like vote and hold others in our circles accountable to vote. And there are things we can do when we join together, like working with voting rights organizations or voter turnout initiatives, or getting involved in communication strategies that are making an effort to communicate, our values when it comes to voting and the preservation of democracy. Right now, I would say a lot of moderate and liberal and progressive faith leaders are starting to engage in this issue. But there's so many tools on the table. If you want to look at what the tools look like on the other side, and perhaps some of the sort of ways in which we're not, say we, very broadly speaking, are not engaging in the way the sort of far right is engaging, you could read chapters 1 and 2 of The Power Worshippers, and the organizations through pastoral facing groups like Faith Wins or Watchmen on the Wall. So, it's important to battle the notion that voting doesn't matter. It really does, not just in national elections, but also state and local elections. Well, there's another thing I want to, talk about. I hope I'm not talking too much here.
That's all right.
But
go ahead.
All politics is local, and the religious right knows that, which is why they're involved in creating these national networks of groups like Moms Demand and the sort of local mom groups and the local groups that get involved in the anti-CRT panic in public schools, which is really a way of kind of funneling, getting parents upset about issues that, in many instances have no relationship to what's happening in their public schools, and is sort of hostile to public education, sort of funneling, whatever kind of grievance they have into those groups, and then training them to get involved in local politics and, through their school boards, and then priming them to get involved in politics in their states. And we need to, remember that lesson too, and create favorable conditions for people to engage politically in local and state politics. So, there are also a lot of different groups that are fighting to preserve our rights, fighting for accountability, for corruption. There are a lot of faith groups that are standing up in opposition to Christian nationalism. We have to remember that, there's no magic bullet here. And again, we have to commit to engagement for the long haul, but everyone can find their lane. And the important thing is really to do something.
Great. So all the way down to the school boards, right? That's what they're doing, all the way down.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Moms for America and those kinds of Defending Ed and those kinds of groups. I mean, they were very successful in taking a lot of the frustrations that people felt around COVID, which frankly, look, I'm a mom of 2 kids. I had 2 kids in public schools at that time. It was really impossible for a lot of us. And they took, but we were dealing with a national, public health problem. And they took all of those frustrations and found a way to funnel them into sort of right-wing grievance. And this is something the movement is really good at doing. They have a kind of grievance and outrage machine that they're very good at figuring out how to translate into political power.
Absolutely. That kind of leads to my last question. And let me say just a little bit as background to the question itself. As you've been alluding to just now and describing, leaders of this movement have spent the last 50 years at least crafting a very specific narrative that sounds like common sense to people because they've heard it over and over and over in church, on the channels they watch and so forth. So the narrative is something like they want people to take back America and return to a time when most of the privilege and power in this country belonged to people like them. as you and I know, a lot of people in this country were left out of that kind of world. They don't want to go back to that. So what I believe is that we need to develop an alternative narrative to the one that they're putting out there and persuade more people to build the kind of world we want to live in. So how do you think we can do that? How can we recraft the narrative, challenge what they're saying, help people understand, see a different way of doing it?
Oh, there's so much to say about this. I mean, look, the great and better stories, which also have the virtue of being true, are really out there, published and promoted over time. But
Yeah.
critics of Christian nationalism and critics of the false history that are put out by people like David Barton, they don't have control of this massive, well-funded propaganda apparatus that spreads those kinds of lies. I mean, no narrative alone is going to defeat that kind of propaganda. We really need to engage in the political process in meaningful ways at all levels. I think that there is a kind of, one thing the right is really good at is articulating a positive vision of activism, of political activism,
Right.
happy warriors. It's sort of what Phyllis Schlafly was articulating when she wrote about the power of the positive woman. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't articulate the dangers we're facing. We absolutely must. But the, Christian nationalist movement is determined to telegraph confidence in the future and tell that positive story about America. And that positive mindset serves to motivate people on the ground engaging in the political process at both the local and national level. They make people feel no matter how young you are, no matter how old you are, whether you're disabled, it doesn't matter. You have a role to play. And I think that is really important. I think that, there, again, no shortage of avenues for engagement. The problems are to a very large degree political. So the solutions will be to a large degree political too.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much. We're coming to the end of our time. Did we miss anything? I mean, is there one more thing maybe you'd like to say for everybody listening?
Sure. I mean, I think sometimes when we think about what has brought us to the present moment and the present circumstances, we tend to think within the time frame of a few decades,
Mhm.
But if we extend our vision back to a few centuries, we have to recognize that there's been so much progress and so many more of us enjoy more rights, and none of those rights were secured without a struggle. So when I think back on the struggles that have brought us to the present moment, I'm really humbled and inspired and above all determined.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for being with us. For anyone hearing this, you're seeing it on my blog or you're seeing it on a website called Imagine, and so there are links here. Please follow them, not only to Catherine's book and her website, but to a lot of other interviews and a variety of other resources. Catherine, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.